December 7th, 1941 dawned with a crimson sun over Pearl Harbor, but it was the modifications taking place in Wright Field, Ohio, that would ultimately seal Japan's maritime fate. Major Paul Irvin G. Pappy Gunn, a former airline pilot turned Army Air Forces engineer, stared at the blueprints spread across his makeshift desk in a converted hangar. The standard North American B-25 Mitchell bomber sat before him like a patient awaiting G's surgery, a surgery that would transform it from a conventional medium bomber into something the Japanese Navy had never encountered, a ship-killing monster with teeth of steel. The inspiration had come from an unlikely source. During the early Pacific campaigns, Allied pilots discovered that Japanese merchant vessels and warships possessed surprisingly light armor on their sides, a design philosophy that prioritized speed and maneuverability over protection. Dart bombing runs from altitude proved frustratingly inaccurate against fast-moving naval targets, with bombs often missing by hundreds of yards as ships executed evasive maneuvers. What the Pacific Theater desperately needed was not more altitude, but a weapon that could engage ships at point-blank range with devastating firepower. Gunn's revolutionary concept centered on replacing the Vifeising B-25 standard glazed nose section with a solid metal nose packed with forward-firing machine guns. The original Norden bomb sight in Bombardier's position would be sacrificed for raw, concentrated firepower. Instead of doctor-opping bombs from 12,000 feet and hoping for the best, these modified Mitchells would swoop down to masthead level and rake enemy vessels with sustained bursts of .50 caliber machine gun fire. The technical challenges were immense. The aircraft's center of gravity had to be recalculated to accommodate the additional weight of ammunition and gun mounts. Cooling systems required redesign to prevent the multiple machine guns from overheating during extended firing sequences. Most critically, the structural integrity of the nose section needed reinforcement to withstand the tremendous vibration and recoil forces generated by 8 Browning Min-2 machine guns firing simultaneously. According to declassified documents from the National Archives, Gunn's team worked around the clock through the winter of 1941 and into early 1942. The first prototype emerged in February 1942, its blunt nose bristling with gun barrels like some Mechanica L porcupine. Test flights revealed both promise and problems. The concentrated firepower was indeed devastating against ground targets, but the aircraft's handling characteristics had changed dramatically. The modified B-25 required more experienced pilots who could master the new flight envelope. The added weight in the nose made the aircraft more nose-heavy, demanding constant trim adjustments. Additionally, the removal of the Bombardier meant the crew was reduced from 5 to 4 men, with the navigator taking on additional responsibilities for target acquisition and communication. By spring 1942, 3 modified aircraft designated as B-25C models were ready for combat evaluation. They would be assigned to the 3rd Attack Group, then operating from Port Moresby in New Guinea. The Japanese, still riding high from their early victories across the Pacific, had no idea that a new predator was about to enter their hunting grounds, one that would turn their own tactical philosophy of speed and light armor into a fatal vulnerability. March 2, 1943 arrived with deceptive calm over the Bismarck Sea, but beneath the azure surface, a massive Japanese convoy was steaming toward Lae, New Guinea, carrying 8,000 troops and desperately needed supplies for the beleaguered garrison. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded the operation from the destroyer Shiraike, confident that his 8 destroyers and 8 transport vessels could successfully run the Allied gauntlet. The Japanese had no way of knowing that circling high above the clouds, Major Edward Larner was leading 18 B-25 gunships toward what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in the Pacific Theater. The modified Mitchells had arrived in theaters 6 months earlier, but this would be their first large-scale engagement against a major Japanese naval force. Larner's squadron had spent weeks perfecting their skip, bombing technique approaching targets at wave-top level, releasing their bombs at the last possible moment so they would skip across the water's surface like stones before detonating against the target's hull. Combined with the devastating firepower of their 8-gun noses, this tactic promised to revolutionize anti-shipping warfare. At 09:15 hours, the convoy's lookout spotted the first wave of Allied aircraft approaching from the northeast. What they expected to see were high-altitude bombers that could be evaded through aggressive maneuvering. Instead, they witnessed something that defied their understanding of aerial warfare. Twin-engine bombers screaming toward them barely 50 feet above the waves, their solid noses winking with muzzle flashes as hundreds of .50 caliber rounds began chewing into the wooden decks and superstructures of the transport ships. Lieutenant Colonel Donald MacDonald led the first attack run against the transport Kyokusei Maru. His B-25 roared over the vessel's bow at 200 miles per hour, 8 machine guns chattering in perfect synchronization. The concentrated firepower was unlike anything the Japanese had experienced. Instead of scattered bullet strikes from strafing fighters, this was a sustained torrent of heavy machine gun fire that swept the ship from stern to bow like an enormous chainsaw. The psychological effect on the Japanese crews was immediate and devastating. Sailors who had trained to defend against high-altitude bombing attacks found themselves facing point-blank gunfire that turned airship's wooden superstructures into splintered ruins. The transport Teo Maru attempted to return fire with her anti-aircraft guns, but the gunship's approach speed and low altitude made accurate tracking nearly impossible. As documented in the official action report filed by 5th Air Force Headquarters, the gunship's 850 caliber machine guns firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds proved devastatingly effective against the Japanese vessel's light construction. Unlike the heavily armored warships of the European theater, Japanese merchant vessels and even destroyers relied on speed and evasion rather than thick steel plating for protection. The sustained machine gun fire from the modified B-25s penetrated this light armor with ease, igniting fuel stores, destroying vital equipment, and creating massive casualties among the crews. Within the first 10 minutes of the attack, 3 transport ships were dead in the water, their superstructures ablaze and their crews abandoning ship. The destroyer Asashio attempted to lay a smokescreen to protect the convoy, but the low-flying gunships simply flew through the smoke and continued their devastating attacks from point-blank range. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea would continue for 3 more days, but the fate of the Japanese convoy was sealed in those first crucial minutes when the B-25 gunships demonstrated that the age of naval immunity from air attack was definitively over. March 4th. 1943 found the waters of the Bismarck Sea littered with the burning hulks of what had once been a proud Japanese convoy, but the true revolution in warfare was just becoming apparent to military analysts on both sides of the Pacific. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, the same pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was now serving as a staff officer analyzing combat reports. As he read the preliminary accounts of the devastating air attacks, he realized that his Navy had encountered something fundamentally new in the annals of warfare: aircraft that function not as bombers but as flying destroyers, capable of delivering the concentrated firepower of a naval vessel while possessing the speed and maneuverability of fighters. The technical effectiveness of the 8-gun nose modifications exceeded even Major Gun's optimistic projections. Each B-25C carried 4,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, enough for sustained firing runs lasting several minutes. The 8 Browning M2 machine guns, firing in perfect synchronization, could deliver over 6,000 rounds per minute of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. When concentrated on a single target, This firepower was equivalent to the broadside of a light cruiser, but delivered from an aircraft that could approach at wave-top level and attack from unexpected angles. The Japanese vessel's construction philosophy, which had served them well in the early stages of the Pacific War, now became their Achilles heel. Transport ships like the Kyokusei Maru and Teo Maru were beuled with wooden superstructures and minimal armor plating to maximize cargo capacity and speed. Against conventional bombing attacks from altitude, their ability to maneuver rapidly had provided effective protection. Against the point-blank machine gun fire from the modified Mitchells, their light construction offered no defense whatsoever. Squadron leader James Big Jim Davies, flying his B-25 Dirty Dora, recorded one of the most vivid accounts of the gunship's effectiveness. Approaching the destroyer Takitsukaz at masthead level, Davies opened fire at a range of 500 yards and maintained his firing run until Faiming, till he was directly over the vessel. The 8 machine guns stitched a line of destruction from the destroyer's bow to her stern, penetrating her thin deck armor and detonating her forward ammunition magazine. The explosion lifted the destroyer's bow completely out of the water before she broke in half and sank in less than 3 minutes. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was perhaps even more significant than the physical damage. Sailors who had spent years training to defend against conventional bomber attacks found themselves helpless against an enemy that attacked from wave-top level with the fiery power of a warship. The traditional naval tactics of evasive maneuvering and anti-aircraft fire proved useless against aircraft that could match the speed of destroyers while delivering sustained, accurate fire from multiple machine guns. According to intelligence reports compiled by the Office of Naval Intelligence and later declassified in 1978, Japanese radio intercepts from the battle revealed the panic and confusion among surviving crew members. One transmission from the transport Iomaru described the attacking aircraft as flying battleships that sawed through our ship like a blade through bamboo. The effectiveness of the modified B-25s extended beyond their primary armament. Many aircraft also arrayed conventional bombs and depth charges, which they could deploy using skip bombing techniques after completing their strafing runs. This combination of machine gun fire followed by explosive ordnance proved particularly devastating against vessels that had already been weakened by the initial gun runs. By the end of the Bismarck Sea engagement, Japanese naval doctrine would require fundamental revision. The age of light, fast vessels relying on maneuverability for protection was ending, replaced by a new reality where aircraft could deliver battleship-level firepower at point-blank range with devastating accuracy. May 15, 1943 marked a turning point not just in Pacific naval warfare, but in the strategic calculations of both Allied and Japanese high commands, as reports of the Bismarck Sea massacre reached headquarters from Tokyo to Washington. Emperor Hirohito himself requested a personal briefing on the new Allied air tactics, while in the Pentagon, General Henry Hop Arnold was already accelerating production of the modified B-25 gunships. The success of Major Gunn's innovation had created a ripple effect that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific theater, forcing both sides to reconsider everything they thought they knew about air-sea warfare. The Japanese response was swift but tragically inadequate. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, convened an emergency meeting of his senior staff to address what intelligence reports now termed the flying destroyer threat. The Japanese had encountered modified aircraft before, but nothing approaching the concentrated firepower and tactical effectiveness of the B-25 gunships. Traditional anti-aircraft defenses, designed to engage high-altitude bombers or individual fighters, proved woefully inadequate against formations of aircraft delivering sustained machine gun fire from masthead level. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, proposed immediate modifications to Japanese merchant vessels and destroyers. His plan called for additional anti-aircraft weaponry, reinforced deck armor, and new tactical formations designed to concentrate defensive fire against low-flying attackers. However, the Japanese industrial base, already strained by 2 years of total war, could not implement these modifications quickly enough or on a scale sufficient to counter the growing threat. Meanwhile, Allied forces were rapidly expanding their gunship capabilities. The success at Bismarck Sea had proven that the concept could work, but full exploitation required trained crews, modified aircraft, and R.F. tactics. Major Guns team at Wright Field was working overtime to convert standard B-25s into the devastating C model configuration. By summer 1943, entire squadrons were being re-equipped with the modified aircraft. The training program for gunship crews emphasized the unique skills required for low-level anti-shipping attacks. Unlike conventional bomber pilots, who could rely on bomb sights and predetermined flight paths, gunship pilots had to master the art of precision flying at wave-top level while coordinating with their gunners to deliver maximum firepower on target. The margin for error was essentially zero. A momentary lapse in concentration could result in the aircraft striking the water or flying directly into enemy anti-aircraft fire. Captain Colin Kelly Jr., one of the early heroes of the Pacific War, was among the first to recognize the broader implications of the gunship concept. In a letter to his brother dated June 20, 1943, Kelly wrote, "These 8-gun Mitchells aren't just modified bombers. They're an entirely new type of weapon that makes every Japanese ship in the Pacific a potential target. The enemy built their navy for speed and maneuverability, but our gunships can match their speed while delivering firepower they never imagined possible from aircraft." Effectiveness of the gunships extended far beyond their immediate tactical impact. Japanese merchant shipping, already under severe pressure from submarine attacks, now faced a new threat that could operate in daylight hours and in areas previously considered safe from air attack. Convoy routes had to be revised, additional escort vessels allocated, and sailing schedules adjusted to minimize exposure to the growing fleet of Allied gunships. Intelligence reports from captured Japanese documents, declassified by the CIA in January 1985, revealed the extent of enemy concern about the new Allied capabilities. One report from the Japanese Naval General Staff described the gunships as representing a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare at sea and recommended immediate development of countermeasures. However, the Japanese ability to develop and implement effective responses was increasingly constrained by resource shortages and the relentless pressure of Allied advances across the Pacific. By autumn 1943, the psychological impact of the gunships was becoming as significant as their physical effectiveness, with Japanese crews increasingly reluctant to venture into areas where the deadly aircraft might be encountered. September 12, 1943 witnessed the next evolutionary leap in gunship warfare as major guns. Engineering teams unveiled the B-25G model at Langley Field, Virginia, an aircraft that would make its predecessors seem almost conservative by comparison. The new variant mounted not 8 but 12 50 caliber machine guns in its solid nose, supplemented by additional guns mounted in side blisters that could de-engage targets during banking turns. The result was an airborne fortress capable of delivering over 9,000 rounds per minute of armor-piercing firepower, transforming the Mitchell bomber into what crews nicknamed the Ship Killer Supreme. Technical challenges of mounting 12 synchronized machine guns in a medium bomber's nose section had pushed American engineering to its limits. The aircraft structure required extensive reinforcement to handle the tremendous recoil forces, while the electrical system needed complete redesign to power the gun mechanisms and heating elements that prevented the weapons from freezing at operational altitudes. Most significantly, the ammunition capacity had to be increased to 4,800 rounds, requiring creative placement of ammunition boxes throughout the aircraft's fuselage. Lieutenant Colonel Donald MacDonald, now commanding the 42nd Squadron of Modified Mitchells, led the first operational test of the G model against a Japanese convoy attempting to resupply their garrison at Rebel. The target was the heavily escorted transport Osaka Maru, accompanied by 3 destroyers and a light cruiser. MacDonald's attack run began at 0730 hours on October 8, 1943, as his formation of 6 G-model gunships approached the convoy at wave-top level through a morning squall. The concentrated firepower of 12 machine guns proved devastating beyond all previous experience. MacDonald's aircraft alone delivered over 1,500 rounds into the Osaka Maru during a single second firing pass. The transport ship's wooden superstructure virtually disintegrated under the impact of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, while her thin steel hull plating was penetrated in dozens of locations. The ship's bridge, radio room, and engine spaces were completely destroyed, leaving the vessel dead in the water and blazing from stem to stern. The Japanese escort vessels attempted to provide defensive fire, but the gunship's speed and low altitude made accurate tracking nearly impossible. The destroyer Hamikaze fired over 200 rounds from her main battery without scoring a single hit, while her anti-aircraft guns proved equally ineffective against targets that appeared and disappeared in seconds while delivering withering return fire. According to combat reports filed with 5th Air Force Headquarters and later analyzed by the Naval War College, the G-model gunships represented a quantum leap in anti-shipping effectiveness. The additional firepower allowed for shorter attack runs that reduced exposure to defensive fire, while the side-mounted guns enabled the aircraft to engage multiple targets during a single pass. Most importantly, the psychological effect on Japanese crews was becoming increasingly apparent through intercepted radio transmissions and prisoner interrogations. The success of the G model led to immediate orders for large-scale production and deployment. By December 1943, over 200 modified Mitchells were operating across the Pacific from the Aleutians to New Guinea. Their presence forced fundamental changes in Japanese naval operations, with convoys now requiring massive escort forces and routing through increasingly circuitous paths to avoid areas where the deadly gunships might be encountered. The evolution of gunship tactics paralleled the aircraft modifications. Pilots developed new formation techniques that maximized their firepower while minimizing vulnerability to defensive measures. The wagon wheel attack, pioneered by Captain Edward Larner's squadron, involved multiple aircraft approaching a target from different angles simultaneously, creating overlapping fields of fire that made evasion impossible. Perhaps most significantly, the gunships began operating in coordination with conventional bombers and torpedo planes, creating combined attacks that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. High-altitude bombers would attack first to suppress anti-aircraft fire, followed by torpedo planes to force evasive maneuvers, with the gunships delivering the coup de grace with their devastating close-range firepower. This coordinated approach proved so effective that by early 1944, Japanese naval commanders were describing encounters with Allied air power as fighting against flying fleets rather than individual aircraft. January 23, 1944 brought an ominous development that would test the seemingly invincible gunships against Japan's most desperate countermeasure: the emergence of specialized fighter units equipped with tactics and aircraft specifically designed to hunt the low-flying Mitchells. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace pilot, had spent months analyzing gunship attack patterns and developing countermeasures from his base at Rabaul. His conclusions were sobering for the Japanese High Command, the only Effective way to stop the devastating gunships was to engage them during their most vulnerable moments. The final approach to target when they were committed to their attack runs and unable to maneuver. Sakai's anti-gunship tactics centered on the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, modified with additional armor protection and heavier armament specifically for engaging the heavily armed Mitchells. The key insight was that gunships, despite their formidable firepower, remained vulnerable during the critical seconds of their attack runs when pilots were focused on their targets rather than defensive maneuvering. Japanese fighters could exploit this vulnerability by timing their attacks to coincide with the gunship's firing passes, striking when the Mitchell crews were least able to respond effectively. The first major test of these new tactics came on February 15, 1944, when a formation of 12 B-25G models approached a Japanese convoy south of Truk Island. Unknown to the American crews, 16 Zero fighters under Sakai's direct command were concealed in cloud cover above the convoy, waiting for the precise moment when the gunships would commit to their low-level attack runs. The resulting engagement would prove that even the most devastating weapons systems had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by determined and skillful opponents. Captain James "Big Jim" Davies, leading the gunship formation in his aircraft Hell's Fury, began his attack run on the transport Yamato Maru at 0-8-40-5 hours. As his Mitchell descended to masthead level and opened fire with all 12 machine guns, Sakai's fighters dove from our concealed positions, approaching the gunships from above and behind at maximum speed. The timing was perfect. The Mitchell crews were completely focused on their attack runs and unable to maneuver defensively without breaking off their attacks. The engagement that followed demonstrated both the lethal effectiveness of the gunships and their inherent vulnerabilities when faced with properly executed fighter attacks. Davies managed to sink the Yamato Maru with a devastating 30-second gun run that left the transport blazing and listing heavily to port. However, as he pulled away from his target, 2 Zeros caught his aircraft with concentrated 20mm cannon fire that destroyed his port engine and killed his navigator. Lieutenant Robert "Lucky" Henderson, flying wing position in Shipwrecker, found himself in an even more desperate situation as 3 Japanese fighters coordinated their attacks with deadly precision. Zero pilots had learned to approach from multiple angles simultaneously, making it impossible for the gunship's defensive gunners to engage all threats effectively. Henderson's aircraft took severe damage to its fuel system and hydraulics before he could escape to friendly territory. According to declassified intelligence reports from the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Center, the Japanese success in developing effective anti-gunship tactics represented significant evolution in the ongoing arms race between offensive and defensive capabilities. The seemingly invincible Mitchell gunships were indeed vulnerable to properly executed fighter attacks, particularly when Japanese pilots were willing to accept the risks involved in engaging such heavily armed opponents. The February 15th engagement resulted in the loss of 3 gunships and damage to 5 others. The highest single DI casualties the modified Mitchells had suffered since entering combat. However, the exchange rate still favored the Americans as the surviving gunships had sunk 4 transport ships and damaged 2 destroyers while shooting down 7 Japanese fighters. The lesson was clear to both sides. The gunships remained devastatingly effective against surface targets, but they required fighter escort when operating in areas where Japanese interceptors might be encountered. This tactical evolution would force changes in Allied operational planning and resource allocation, while encouraging the Japanese to continue developing increasingly sophisticated countermeasures against the flying ship killers that had revolutionized Pacific warfare. April 10, 1944 marked the beginning of what would become known as the Great Gunship Hunt, as Japanese naval aviation committed its remaining elite pilots and most advanced aircraft to a coordinated campaign designed to eliminate the Allied gunship threat before it could participate in the anticipated invasion of the Marianas. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Mobile fleet, had convinced Imperial H. headquarters that the destruction of the B-25 gunships was essential for any hope of defending Japan's inner defensive perimeter. The plan, designated Operation Flying Dragon, would concentrate over 300 of Japan's finest fighter pilots in a series of coordinated attacks designed to lure the gunships into carefully prepared killing zones. The Japanese strategy was based on intelligence gathered from months of studying gunship operations and tactics. Analysis of American radio communications had revealed predictable patterns in how the modified Mitchells approached their targets, while captured Allied aircrew had provided detailed information about the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. Most critically, the Japanese had identified the gunship's Achilles heel, their vulnerability during the final approach phase when pilots were focused on target acquisition rather than defensive maneuvering. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, was well aware of Japanese intentions through communications intelligence provided by Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor. However, the strategic situation in the Central Pacific demanded continued aggressive operations against Japanese shipping, regardless of the increased risks to the gunship squadrons. The upcoming invasion of Saipan required the elimination of Japanese naval forces throughout the Marianas, making the continued use of the deadly Mitchells an operational necessity despite enemy countermeasures. The first major engagement of Operation Flying Dragon occurred on May 2, 1944, when 18 B-25G models from the 42nd and 93rd Squadrons approached what appeared to be a lightly defended convoy near Guam, unknown to the American crews. The convoy was a carefully prepared trap, with over 60 Japanese fighters positioned in layered defensive formations designed to engage the gunships from multiple directions simultaneously. Colonel Edward Larner, now commanding the combined gunship force, led his formation toward the convoy at dawn, expecting to encounter minimal resistance based on intelligence reports. The target appeared ideal: 6 transport ships with only light escort, perfect for demonstrating the continued effectiveness of the modified Mitchells against Japanese shipping. However, as the formation descended to attack altitude, radar operators aboard the escort vessels detected the massive fighter formation positioned to intercept the approaching gunships. The battle that ensued would be remembered as one of the largest air-to-air engagements in Pacific theater history. Japanese fighters, led by some of their most experienced aces including Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nishizawa and Captain Tetsuzo Iwamoto, executed perfectly coordinated attacks designed to exploit every known vulnerability in the gunship's defensive capabilities. The Mitchell crews, despite their heavy armament, found themselves facing opponents who understood their tactics and had developed specific countermeasures for every aspect of their operations. Staff Sergeant William Wild Bill Morrison, tail gunner in Larner's lead aircraft, Pacific Predator, provided one of the most vivid accounts of the engagement in his post-mission debriefing, later preserved in the National Archives. According to Morrison's testimony, the Japanese fighters approached in precisely timed waves, with the first group drawing defensive fire while follow-up attacks struck from unexpected angles. The coordination was unlike anything the gunship crews had previously encountered, demonstrating that their opponents had evolved far beyond the disorganized resistance of earlier engagements. Despite facing overwhelming odds, the gunship crews fought with desperate courage and tactical skill. Captain Robert Iron Bob Williams managed to shoot down 3 Japanese fighters with his aircraft's nose guns before being forced to ditch in the ocean after his aircraft sustained critical damage. Lieutenant Charles Chuck Patterson's Mitchell, though losing 2 engines to fighter attacks, successfully completed its attack run and sank the transport Nichiren Maru before crash landing on a nearby coral atoll. The engagement resulted in the loss of 7 gunships and damage to 6 others, the highest casualty rate the modified Mitchells had ever suffered. However, the strategic impact remained in favor of the Allies, as the surviving aircraft had destroyed 4 enemy vessels and inflicted severe casualties on the Japanese fighter force, losses that Japan could no longer afford to sustain. August 15, 1945 dawned over Tokyo Bay with the sound of surrender negotiations. But for the crews of the B-25 gunships scattered across Pacific air bases from Okinawa to the Philippines, victory carried the bitter knowledge that their revolutionary weapon system had fundamentally altered naval warfare forever. Major Paul Pappy Gunn, now promoted to colonel and serving as chief aviation engineer for the Far East Air Forces, stood on the deck of the USS Missouri as Emperor Hirohito's representatives prepared to sign the Form I'll Surrender documents. In his weathered hands, he held a captured Japanese intelligence report that described the gunships as the weapon that made our ships defenseless and credited them with sinking over 400 vessels during the Pacific Campaign. The statistical impact of the modified Mitchells was staggering by any measure. From their first combat deployment in March 1942 through the war's end, the B-25 gunships had accounted for the destruction of 637 Japanese vessels, ranging from massive transports to destroyers and even light cruisers. More significantly, they had forced fundamental changes in Japanese naval doctrine, requiring massive resources for convoy escort that could have been used elsewhere. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Intercepted communications revealed that Japanese crews increasingly refused to sail in areas where the deadly aircraft might be encountered. The technological legacy of Gunn's innovation extended far beyond the immediate tactical success of the modified Mitchells. The concept of concentrated aircraft armament had influenced the design of subsequent attack aircraft, including the Douglas A-26 Invader and the Grumman A-1 Sky Raider. More importantly, the gunships had demonstrated that traditional naval architecture, based on light construction and high speed, was obsolete in an age where aircraft could deliver battleship-level firepower with pinpoint accuracy. Lieutenant General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, had recognized early in the Pacific Campaign that the gunships represented more than just modified bombers. They were harbingers of a new era in warfare where air power could achieve strategic objectives previously requiring massive naval forces. In his post-war memoir, published by Duell, Sloan, and Pierce in 1949, Kenney wrote, "The B-25 gunships didn't just sink Japanese ships, they sank the entire concept of traditional naval warfare and forced us to completely rethink how wars would be fought in the future." The human cost of developing and operating the revolutionary aircraft was significant, but not disproportionate to their strategic impact. Allied records indicated that 237 gunship crew members had been killed in action, while over 400 had been wounded or taken prisoner. However, these casualties were balanced against the thousands of American lives saved by the gunship's ability to interdict Japanese reinforcements and supplies that might otherwise have reached threatened Allied positions. Japanese post-war analyses, declassified by the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1978, revealed the extent to which the gunships had disrupted their naval operations. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, admitted in Allied interrogations that the modified Mitchells had forced Japan to abandon entire convoy routes and had made daylight naval operations virtually impossible in areas where the aircraft could be deployed. The economic impact was equally severe, as the gunship's effectiveness forced the diversion of scarce resources to convoy escort duties rather than offensive operations. The strategic lessons learned from the gunship program would influence military thinking for decades to come. The demonstration that existing weapon systems could be radically modified to create entirely new capabilities became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. The concept of rapid technological adaptation and battlefield innovation, exemplified by major guns modifications, would be applied to everything from helicopter gunships in Vietnam to precision-guided munitions in later conflicts. As the Missouri's crew prepared for the surrender ceremony, Colonel Gunn reflected on the remarkable journey from that first experimental aircraft in Ohio to the hundreds of modified Mitchells that had helped to bring Japan to its knees. The B-25 gunships had indeed proven that Japan never expected 8-gun noses to saw ships apart, but more importantly, they had demonstrated that American industrial ingenuity and tactical innovation could overcome any enemy advantage through determination, skill, and the willingness to completely reimagine how warfare could be conducted.